welcome to the final session. This is it. We're wrapping things up with a fantastic presentation. Not being racist is no longer enough. This session is sponsored by CMPA, the BC branch as well. If you haven't been around and don't know who I am, well, my name is Anand. I am the manager of motion picture programs and services at Actsafe. And you've been doing this for 2 days now, so I'm sure I don't have to tell you to go back into Remo and mute yourself over there and switch off your video over there so that we have no interference, crosstalk, that type of thing. So I don't have to say that, right? Right. Okay. So your presenter today is Alden E. Habacon. So Alden is one of Canada's leading diversity and inclusion strategists and facilitators. He is well known in this field and is highly regarded for his over 16 years of impact. His innovative work around inclusive leadership, unconscious bias, and intercultural training. He works with leadership in a wide range of professions and sectors throughout Canada, including the legal community, social services, the public sector, municipalities, first responders, and large private corporations. Organizations that Alden has helped in developing diversity and inclusion strategies include Van City, First West Credit Union, UBC Piatra, Technical Safety BC, WorkSafe BC, and the Vancouver Airport Authority. So a couple of things, if you have any questions, please remember we are using the question and answer button or the question and answer field on Zoom. So do not type anything into the chat box, use the Q&A button. Your questions for Alden will be handled through there. And other than that, Alden is going to take it from here. Welcome, Alden.
Thanks so much. Welcome. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be asked and invited to contribute to the learning and the development that has been happening over the last couple of days. And I hope this next 90 minutes is meaningful and really gives folks some tools and some language on really fostering psychological safety and more meaningfully talking about racism and anti-racism in all of your work. As I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining all of you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I want to acknowledge the welcome that my family and I receive for the opportunity to live, work, and play here. It's an enormous honor for us, and I want to just express my gratitude for this. As well, I just want to express my gratitude to the First Nations here and all across Canada and the United States for their ongoing openness to our efforts around reconciliation and for making sure that this is meaningful for all of us. As was mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about racism and how we can move past and kind of really talk more meaningfully about this. I've set up a Menti. So for those of you that are familiar, all you got to do is grab your phone, and that's the easiest way to log into the Menti, to join into the Menti. Menti is an online polling tool, participation tool, and this will enable all of you to be able to engage in this other than just listening to me speak, which I think would be rather boring. So if you want to just grab your phone and point your camera at the QR code, that will open up the Menti, or you can go to Menti on a browser page and menti.com. You'll see the instructions there. And enter the event code 6321721. And what'll happen is your screen will turn purple like this, and you'll see a thumbs up there in the middle. Just hit that thumbs up, and here I'll show you what it looks like. I'll just share my screen here so you can see what I see on my end. And so this will give me a sense of who has been able to log in. And so we've got a few polls. I want to hear from you. I want this to be interactive. And so I want to, hopefully you'll engage. We have disabled the chat, and we're asking folks just to funnel their questions to the Q&A, which is being moderated by Susan, who you can't see, but she's here with me. Some people might wonder about that, and this is just to ensure that whatever comments are made are safe for everyone. This is just an effort to make sure that this conversation is as safe as possible for all the people that are attending. And so we're gonna vet those if hope folks don't mind that. But that said, still would love for you to participate. There is some polling, so There will be some opportunity for you to share some of your thoughts, and I'll just ask that folks be respectful and thoughtful about the comments you make to each other in the what you share in the Menti. Okay, so let me go back to my my slides here as we get going. I will make a hard stop at about 40 minutes in. I've got my timer running here in front of me, and just to give you a bit of a break so that you can stretch your legs and refresh your coffee and get some water. So we'll do that. All right, just a little bit about myself, some of the organizations that I've had a chance to work with recently. I know, thanks so much for that really warm introduction and just giving you a little bit of a sense of what I do and the work that I've done. Once upon a time, I was responsible for the diversity and inclusion portfolio for the television network of CBC Television, and so worked all across the country in supporting the work there. And that seems like so long ago, when it felt like we really were just trying to figure how best to represent and reflect the all of Canada and in the work that was being done at the CBC. So some organizations here, and I do a bit of work all across the country. I've got two boys. For those of you that do know me, this is a kind of updated picture in case you haven't seen my two boys in a while. This is Aiden and Ray. Aiden is 10. When feels like he's going on 16, and that's Ray. The younger one is Ray. He's 7, also going on 16. They have this really funny dynamic. They're very competitive, despite being 3 years apart from each other. Anyways, I told them that I would be sharing their picture, and so I always ask for their permission, just as a kind of a habit, and ask if there's anything they would like for me to share about them. And this time they said, what they would like for me to share with you about them is their small collection of black and brown action figures. You'll see them there. We've been collecting, making a point to collect black characters in the form of action figures over the last 10 years. And as well, it's a chance for us to acknowledge that this is Black History Month. So you'll notice on the far left there, that Green Lantern in the front, that's John Stewart. At one time, that was the only black action figure I could find that was cool, that I thought, and maybe appropriate, that I thought Aiden would like. And so that was like back when he was born. And the nice thing is, over time, the characters have grown. Like, we have characters now, and of course I can't just get them because they're black. They have to be cool. Otherwise, it doesn't really feel like a meaningful part of the collection. And so that's Luke Cage in the front, if you're wondering who that is. And anyways, hopefully you'll recognize some of those characters. There's Spider-Man in the back there, and Black Panther. Anyhow, I bring this up only because I do lots of work around representation, both in workplaces and media and so forth. And I just want to encourage parents to be thinking about how we do this early. My dream is to raise two boys that don't need diversity and inclusion training. And what I realized was, if we weren't intentional about this, these two boys, despite being two, children of color and eventually adults of color, people of color, could grow up their entire childhood not having any representation in their toys. And these aren't necessarily the main characters. And Luke Cage is certainly not a character that's marketed to kids. So this requires a bit of effort. It would be much smaller of a collection if we weren't intentional about this and thoughtful about this. And my hope is it does matter. I remember growing up as a kid not having any action figures in my life, or superheroes, let alone action figures, but just superheroes in my life that weren't white, that weren't, the cultural majority, that didn't reflect or give me an opportunity to pretend to be something other than a white man. And so this was, I'm hoping this will have an impact on them as adolescents and as kids. Now, the reality is, not just parents, but everyone is finding themselves having to have really complex conversations as we've kind of followed the events of the world, and namely, the death of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so back in June, this is a picture from Vancouver. I'm sure some of you might have photos of protests that took place in June 2020 in Toronto. I remember this day particularly because my boys don't normally watch the news. If they do come across me watching the news, they find it boring. And for a while, they weren't even allowed to be in the same room when we watched the news. It's just stuff that I think they don't really need to know about. In any case, it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was watching the protests in Vancouver on TV. And Aiden, my oldest son, comes in the room, and he notices this, and he says to me, "Daddy, why is no one social distancing?" And so at first I was like, oh, thank God he can tell when people are social distancing. That's good. That's going to be a good thing. This is back early in June and first wave is really picking up. And so I thought, you know what? Here's a chance. Here's my teachable moment. I'm gonna try to explain to him as best as I could at a level of 10-year-old, Black Lives Matter. And so we talked about this. We had a little, and I thought it was going pretty good. The younger one wasn't really paying attention, but he seemed locked in, and we're having a bit of a conversation. And then he surprised me. He says to me, he looks me in the eye and he goes, "Daddy, does this mean that when I grow up, people are going to treat me differently because I'm brown?" And I'll be honest with you, I was not ready for that question. The awful reality is I was going to say yes, but it wasn't clear to me that he is seeing that. And so on one hand, I was like, it sounds like he understands racism or racial discrimination anyways as a concept, but he hasn't felt it yet. He hasn't experienced it firsthand yet. And that's awesome, because I'm sure at his age, when I was his age, I had already felt what it was like to be different, to not be white looking, and that experience of not being white was clear to me already as a child. Not his case, and I was trying to compute in my head: is today the day I burst this bubble, or can I push this a few more years? And then my heart sank, to be honest with you, because earlier that week I had spoken to a few friends and colleagues who were Indigenous, friends and colleagues that were Black, that had children who looked Indigenous and who looked Black, and they were sharing some of the stories and some of the conversations that they'd had with their kids around all the things that were happening. And they had shared with me that they'd already had this conversation much before 10 years old. So Aiden already had a few more years, and I thought to myself, wow, I really didn't realize how much privilege, even as a family of color, even as a father of color and a son of color, we had in not being Black and in not being Indigenous. We actually created a bubble, and not just me. His teachers at school, his friends, our community. We have done that for him, but at some point, unless things change really, really quickly, I'm going to have to prepare him for this as well. So lots of complex things going on. And I share that only to say, my hope is that, not only, my hope is that what I'm going to share with you today not only benefits you in terms of your work and your workplace, working in this space of the performing arts, but also in terms of your conversations at home and our thoughtfulness at home and how we behave as allies, as we attempt to be allies in our personal lives. In any case, I get asked all the time, what has made this moment different? Why did we see a different response to George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death? And of course, those weren't the only two events. There was a series of events that were contributing to that. But I want to step back for a moment and just look at the year. Look at maybe the last 2-3 years, maybe the last 10 years, and there were other things that were happening, and I want to acknowledge them as well. Prior to the sudden refocus onto racial inequity, a lot of the work that I was doing was in response to Me Too. I was helping, I've been asked to come in and work in a lot of male-dominant environments, crews of carpenters, software development firms, first responders, and a lot of the response was to how Me Too had impacted their workplaces. So working with a lot of men, work through some of the anxiety that they were experiencing as Me Too was making it really clear bad behavior is no longer going to be tolerated. The abuses, the bullying, the mistreatment of women in workplaces was no longer going to be allowed to just happen. And there were consequences. Even if you had done things in the past, there are consequences coming. And so that shifted the tone in a lot of workplaces. Add to that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after about a decade's worth of work, had released its call to actions. At the same time, a number of provinces and our country overall had begun to adopt the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So there was a heightened conversation about that also. COVID-19 had put a lot of people, kind of canceled a lot of the things in our lives that had made us, kind of too busy to reflect on things. I wasn't taking Aiden to hockey practice, for example, anymore, and there wasn't extracurricular stuff. So a lot of people working from home or being at home a lot. And maybe that gave us a bit more mental space, a bit more bandwidth to be reflective and to sit and think and cry, right? And I just felt for days, I just cried as the video of the tragic deaths played on TV, all kind of coming together to form our moment. And so, I think we owe a big thank you to all the activists and the advocates and the allies who were involved and continue to push and continue to fight for all those causes, because I think that all contributed to our response to what happened in June. And so when I get asked, what is the distinction between what happened, what's going on now, and maybe our response to Black Lives Matter in the past and years past, these are the three key things that keep coming up in conversation for me with people in workplaces and outside of our workplaces. So number one, not being racist is no longer enough. And maybe once upon a time that was, like, you could say, like, I'm just not a racist. That's good enough. And maybe we didn't have the urgency, or we didn't have the tools or the language. But I'm going to speak a little bit about this today as to why it's no longer enough. I think what's changed is our understanding of what racism is versus racial discrimination, versus saying things that are racially discriminatory or acting in a way that's hurtful to people. And we're talking about something a little more intense and in depth than that. Number two, not having a position, maintaining silence, remaining silent is a position. And I think for a while, a lot of people said, well, it doesn't really affect me. I'm not racist. So, but I don't feel like I need to be, that engaged or involved. You might even hear people say, I'm of the school that actually all lives matter, right? Like, you might hear that and you're like, huh? Do you really get what's happening? So I don't really have a position. And what we're saying now is, well, that is a position. That is a position. And I've known this for a long time. I just think back to when I was first exposed to feminism in my 20s, early 20s, at SFU. I was in a third year feminism class. It was part of my visual arts degree at SFU, at the School for Contemporary Arts. And I remember hearing this, that as a man, not having a position was a position. So this is not a new message, but for some reason, it feels really like it's hitting home now for people. And then third, intent versus impact in those moments where we're having to think about which really matters. I told a joke. I made a decision. I made a comment. It wasn't my intention to be hurtful. And maybe we relied a little bit more on our intent back, once upon a time. But now we realize that actually, impact matters now. It's always mattered, but for some reason it feels heightened. And like I said, it's all those movements together combined have made us far more attuned to these three factors. And I want to give you a very specific example. You might remember this in the news from June of last summer. What had happened was Stockwell Day. So some of you might be familiar with Stockwell Day. Very influential political leader, strategist, and has had huge impact on the political landscape in Canada. This is not just some random leader. This is Stockwell Day. He's on the TELUS board. He was on the TELUS board at the time and kind of retired from his life in politics and kind of forefront of his politics. Anyways, he was on CBC television and on Power and Politics on that show. Very highly watched show. Very popular show for CBC. And of course, because of the timing of his presence on television, he was asked, what, can you speak to this a little bit? That's what everyone's talking about. This is on people's minds. June 4th would have been a Friday. June 5th would have been the Saturday that picture was that I showed you earlier. And his comment was, you know what? I can really relate to people's experiences of racism, because when I was a child, I was mocked in school for wearing glasses. And that didn't land very well. The impact of that, I get his intent. I absolutely get his intent. He didn't have to explain it to me. I know what he was. In my heart, I genuinely believe that he meant to demonstrate some empathy. But the impact of his statement, it was hurtful. It was dismissive. And TELUS moved very, very quickly. The law firm that he was connected to moved very, very quickly on this to make clear that that statement in no ways reflected their values, without actually spelling out what those values were or what their stance was in terms of anti-racism. Maybe actions sometimes speak louder than words, right? Maybe TELUS doesn't need to tell us what their values are because they acted, right? And so that played out. So anyways, it's just an example. And I often wonder if this was said prior to George Floyd's murder or Breonna Taylor's murder, if the response would have been the same. I don't know. We could kind of, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I was shocked, to be honest with you, how fast and firm the reaction was from corporate leadership, and rightly so. Okay, so just to be clear, just so we're setting up the framework for this conversation, I want to make a distinction between racially discriminatory behavior versus racism. And this is the piece that I think is, and I've been sharing this for a number of years now, so this isn't new for me for 2020. I was maybe probably sharing this as early as maybe 2015, but for whatever reason, it just didn't feel as quite, there wasn't really a critical mass that had an understanding of this. So just to make sure that you're clear and you understand what we're speaking to. So racially discriminatory behavior, right? Language, behavior. This is stuff. These are statements or actions that are hurtful. It might be unintended, but they're hurtful. Sometimes they are intentional, but they're discriminatory in their meaning. They're discriminatory in in what's being implied by what's said and what's done there. Racism, by contrast, refers to the historic accumulation of racial oppression. So it's historic and it's accumulated over time. Right? In the case of the history of slavery in the United States, it's over 600 years old, right? So it's accumulation of racial oppression in the US over that 600 years. And if you go back into Europe, even before that, right? The early, slave trade of the Portuguese, right? So depending on, what history you go back to, right? So this is accumulated oppression of people by their race over time. And this oppression manifests in our institutions and in our systems in ways that don't involve people. So in policies, in the prominent stereotypes that might be held, not just by the people, but by the culture, the organizational habits that organization might have, the organizational culture, the practices, the things that would make up how that organization got things done. And those things can exist in those systems and those institutions, regardless of the intent of the people who work or use those systems. So you could actually remove all that racially discriminatory behavior and racially discriminatory language, and racism still exists, because racism it tends to live embedded in the forms that you can see there in their list, as policies, as perceptions, as habits, as pathways, how we process information, how we process people's applications, and so on and so forth. A bit more than just looking at people's intention. We're looking at the impact of all of this stuff over time, the accumulation of time. So if you understand this, it's really easy to accept that it would be impossible for reverse racism to exist. Because for it to be reversed, you'd have to reverse the historic accumulation of the racial oppression. So you'd have to reverse the 600 years of racial oppression of Black Americans and African American people, and impose that onto a different group, a reverse group, to maybe the cultural majority today, and allow that to play out for 600 years. That would be a reverse. Not going to happen, and we don't have a time machine. So I hope that's clear. It is possible to witness and be on the receiving end of reverse discrimination. That does happen. And we don't want that either. We don't want anyone feeling discriminated against because of their race, but it would not be reverse racism. These little nuances, this kind of technical understanding of this matters. It matters because we're trying to have more sophisticated conversations about what it means to be an anti-racist organization and what it means to be an inclusive organization. So simply put, not being racist, that would fall under not engaging in racially discriminatory language and behavior. Being anti-racist would refer to analyzing, addressing, disrupting, acknowledging, and removing the historic accumulation of racial oppression from our institutions, our systems, in the form of policies and ... And knowing that they exist there regardless of the intent of the people in those systems. So you could have an entire workplace where everyone says, I'm not racist, and know that that doesn't mean that there isn't racism there. We want to address the racism as it's embedded into the system and institutions. Okay, I hope that made sense for folks. Now, the biggest shift in the conversation for me, and I'm really working hard to help people kind of see this shift in thinking, is that for me, racism, and actually sexism and homophobia and transphobia and ageism and ableism, all the isms, all the forms of discrimination for me are no longer a moral or ethical argument. They're a health and wellness issue. As you can see on the screen here, I'm referring to this article written by Douglas Jacobs, who wrote, who refers to this body of research in New York Times, where what he found was there's at least 700 studies that link discrimination and poor physical and mental well-being. So this is important for us to recognize. Sometimes what kind of how I used to engage in this is, if I saw racially discriminatory language or behavior, I might make an effort to call it out, or, we might refer to call that person in if you're that's more your inclination, and just to let them know that was hurtful. And what can sometimes happen is a person might say, well, how is that racist? Explain to me. How is that sexist? Explain that to me. And you know what? I'm at this place now where I don't need to get into that conversation anymore. I just want to let people know that's unsafe. That is affecting the physical and mental well-being of people around you, whether they're racialized or not, whether they're gender diverse from you or not. It is affecting the physical and mental well-being of the community and the folks that you work with. And that's what we want to pay attention to. I may not be an expert in sexism or ageism or homophobia, but I know that is hurtful and it creates an unsafe environment. And I imagine, being that this is a community of people that are aware and intentional about safety at workplaces, you get what I'm saying. And all we're really trying to do, and often all I'm really trying to do, is expand people's culture of safety to include psychological safety. My assumption is that the majority of people who show up at work already are, wanting to create an environment that's physically safe. And, I do lots of work with, folks in trades and folks that work in construction. And I know that they're paying attention to each other's safety. What I wanted them to do is expand that to include psychological safety and, discrimination, discriminatory language and behavior. That creates an environment that affects people's psychological and eventually physical well-being. So we want to treat it as a health and safety issue. Let me share with you an example of how we've done this well in society. Do you remember once upon a time when we smoked at work? I remember being able to smoke at school, and there was a smoke room at SFU, and I'm a former smoker, and I remember, trying to sneak in there in between classes, and every once in a while you'd catch your professor there and you'd have a cigarette with your instructor. I'm not sure if any of you remember this. And we would go to class pretending like we didn't smell like that smoke room. Of course we did. And in any case, I remember when they got rid of it. So despite the $1 million ventilation system they had put in, the feedback was having that smoke room in the building added to it harmed people's psychological and physical well-being. Like, there was no way that the secondhand smoke, even if it was, dissipated, wasn't making people feel unsafe, physically and mentally unsafe. So they pushed it outside. And I remember being so grumbly about it. I remember complaining to my friends and colleagues, I have the right. It's my right. It's my moral right. I understand the risks and it's my right. And one day I remember SFU just making really clear, that they got that. This wasn't an attempt to take away my right. They understood that I knew the risks. They respected that. But I didn't have the right to threaten the psychological or physical well-being of my classmates or the staff, the employees at SFU. And they reminded us that as employers and as an educational institution, they were legally obligated, not just morally obligated, but legally obligated to ensure that everyone could go to school and work there with both psychological and physical safety, and secondhand smoke was a threat to that. And I got it. I get it. It wasn't like, I could fight that. I couldn't argue that. It was like, well, if I understood the risks, that meant I understood the risk that would have to those who didn't want to smoke or didn't choose to smoke. And so similarly, that's all that we're trying to get at, is for people to understand that the impact of racism in our society, beyond the unearned disadvantage that it actually causes on people, the day-to-day impact of things like microaggression, the day-to-day impact of non-inclusive language and behavior, is that people's physical and psychological well-being is affected. So we want healthy, safe work environments. I know you do. That's why you're part of this organization. And so we want to just embed that and just ensure that we're including that as part of the effort that you're making. All right. So just simply put, treat discrimination as a health and safety issue. You'll know what to do. And with the work that I've been doing with Van City, for example, and some of the other financial institutions that I'm working with, they'll ask me, what do we do if someone comes in and goes off on a racist tirade, on one of our Indigenous employees? I said, you know what? Just treat it like someone just dumped a bunch of asbestos on their counter. What would you do? And they're like, we know exactly what to do. I go, do that. And make sure that you take care of your staff member, their short-term needs and their long-term needs. Because we know that exposure to asbestos likely will have a long-term effect, and we're going to want to pay attention to that as well. And they're like, I hadn't thought of that. And my question to them was, would you make it mandatory for that employee to get, see a doctor, to get, physical tests to make sure they were okay? And they're like, of course we would. Asbestos exposure is a serious thing. I go, treat racism the same way. Right? I'm trying to get to this place where if an employee is exposed to hurtful, racially discriminatory language and behavior, it's mandatory counseling. And even if they're like, yeah, I'm good, I'm okay. Not everyone wants to say, like, that really hurt me today, that really affected me today. But we know that we just don't know what they're going to take home. We just don't know what's going to stick in the back of their mind and plant roots and grow into something, awful. And sometimes we don't know until it's too late, until it's, let's treat all of those incidences seriously, even if they're saying to you, I'm fine. It's great that you ask, but maybe we get professional help anyways, just to make sure, just to absolutely make sure, right? Just no difference. Someone cut their hand on set, right? And they're like, no, it's good. The Band-Aid's good. And you're like, yeah, you know what? I still kind of need you to see a doctor. We're still going to have to write that up. I know it's just a little thing, and you wrapped it up with a Band-Aid and it looks good, and you're probably going to continue work. But you know what? Just out of due diligence, I'm going to have someone who's got a bit more experience and skill than I do to take a look at that for you. Okay? Just for your own safety. I'd hate for this to be much worse than we thought. And, and you might have a story of a time when we ignored it and it turned out to be way worse, and you're remembering that. Why treat, our exposure to discriminatory language and behavior, non-inclusive language and behavior, any different? Okay. So a couple of things I want to share with you over this next hour or so is establish for you a common language and framework around equity, diversity, safety, and anti-racism. I feel like we're talking about all these things all the time now, and I'm not always sure that we are using these words in the same way. Some of these words have experienced a bit of what's called semantic stretch. And so just to make sure we've got a sense, and one of the first questions often that people will ask is, what do you mean by diversity? Does diversity include making sure we have enough plugins for people who drive electric cars? And I'm like, it could, but that's not really what I'm actually focusing on in terms of my work. So we can focus that a bit. I want to share with you, and we'll start with this concept actually right after this. After I go through these key objectives, is talking a little bit about intent versus impact. I actually think that all of the work around inclusion, around equity, around anti-racism is all tied to this core concept of making sure we're having an impact that aligns with our intent. I genuinely believe that people come to work every day hoping to have a positive impact on the people that they work with them, work for them, not always how things land, and we want to close that gap. We'll talk about the interconnection, the interdependence of psychological safety and inclusion, and then give you as well a bit of clarity around the journey towards being a more psychologically safe work environment, a more inclusive work environment. And some of you might already be using this in terms of a kind of conceptually mapping your journey towards being an anti-racist organization as well. So we'll review that also, okay? So first thing I want to do is just ground this in the vision, mission, and core values of Actsafe. I'm hoping that you've already had a chance to talk about this throughout the last couple of days. You'll see the core values there at the bottom: collaboration, innovation, accessibility. So here's my big question, and I want to bring you to the Menti now to talk about this. You'll notice that your phone will have changed. How might being a more inclusive and anti-racist workplace contribute to living or modeling the values of Actsafe? So let me take you to here. Here's the QR code again for those of you that just joined. If you missed that earlier, here's the QR code there. You might have also noticed in the chat that there's a code there for the Menti, and you can click that, and that'll take you to the Menti as well. And I just want to give you a chance to anonymously share what you think, how you think being a more inclusive and anti-racist workplace might contribute to the living through or the demonstrating of the core values that Actsafe has already articulated on its website and in all of its communications and its purpose for being. So let's see if there's any thoughts here. Not yet. So I'll wait here. Hopefully you've all had a chance to log in. I'll just give a pause there while you have a chance to answer that. Awesome. So a few people. I did get a question. Is it okay if we take screenshots of this presentation? Absolutely. Has cause and effect for discrimination in health been proven? I'm surprised that 700 studies only show a link. You know what surprised me actually about that article? That there were 700 studies, to be honest with you. Why did we need 700 studies? I think we would have been good at 500, maybe even 200. I actually think we resist this. There's something about when we see the data, people are like, yeah, that can't be true. That can't be the case. I'm not sure if it's causal or it's correlative. I haven't had a chance to review all the 700 studies, but there's part of me that's I'm not sure it matters. At 700 studies, correlative or causative, I'm not sure it would matter. We just know that there's a connection. In order for us to genuinely have healthy workplaces, we're going to have to remove discrimination from our workplaces, whether it's sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, whatever it might be. Yeah, but that's a good question. There's only a link there to the one article. I don't have the full link to all the studies, but maybe the article in New York Times has more there. So let's take a look at some of your answers in the Menti. Inclusion of different perspectives will drive innovation in ways that homogeneity cannot, and the research on that is very, very clear. Both the anecdotal research we've seen from businesses, as well as there's an article, if you're wondering, if you want to look up in Scientific American that came out in 2018 that speaks specifically to this. Collaboration is so much more valuable when people come from different backgrounds. Absolutely. And you know what? I'm actually trying to get people to think of collaboration differently. Collaboration absolutely is the ability to work effectively with other people, but it begins with making sure that everyone that is trying to collaborate has what they need to be able to contribute. If people are missing things, if they don't have inclusion to start with, that collaboration is going to be lopsided. And what you'll find is that the most prominent, most empowered, those people who feel safest will be able to contribute the most. And guess what? So that shows up in the work, and that shows up in what gets done, maybe what projects get greenlit. Acknowledge challenges to marginalized groups, and in contrast, the existence of unearned advantage. All right, so we do need to do this, we do need to help people to understand, that there is, an imbalance of opportunity. We live and work in systems that produce an unearned advantage for some and an unearned disadvantage for others, and that unearned disadvantage has been historic. It has accumulated over time. This is not something that's just happening in 2021. This has been happening for hundreds of years. And so we want to acknowledge those challenges. And I think that's required to be able to collaborate, innovate, and create an environment that is accessible. All right, it's 2021. All right, just get on with it already. The mental health of individuals makes for the betterment for the company and everyone. I totally agree. Absolutely. It makes for a kind of a safer, healthier work environment for everybody, not just for those that might be experiencing marginalization. It actually does improve health and well-being for everyone. Inclusion allows people to participate in their full human selves and leads to more innovation, more access, and true collaboration. Thank you. You've basically just articulated the business case as it might be related to Actsafe through the lens of Actsafe, right? And that's, part. Sometimes we need a reminder, especially when work, we get busy with work. Less stress, and how much does stress affect our well-being? Right? It's just, we know that discrimination leads to stress and all sorts of anxiety and psychological impact. Inclusion is fundamental to safety at a fundamental level, not only in the workplace, but for society on a whole and at a global level. Thank you for that. Great comment. People will feel more comfortable sharing their ideas when they feel safer. That's absolutely right. And I'll share with you a poll in a second. Around that, you need inclusion to build real accessibility. Otherwise, you're dictating how people can join you. Nice. Right? I know we have standards around accessibility, but in the end, we still need to hear from people. We still need to double check. Like, did that help? Did this standard actually help? Maybe the minimum standard is X and we've met that, but is that what's needed actually to ensure that you feel included? And that may not be it. They may actually say, you may have colleagues that say, you know what, I'm so glad that all this is in place. You've made sure that I feel like I can physically, be a part of this workplace, but I might be missing this. And so one of the things that we're going to speak to today is I want to share with you a technical understanding of when people feel included. Wouldn't it be great if we could have that same analysis, like a technical analysis of when people feel included, how much that would change the way we go about this work? Okay, so thank you for being so generous and sharing those thoughts. Let me come back to my slides. And so I want to go back to this idea of intent versus impact. Intentionality is absolutely key to creating an environment that is psychologically and physically safe, that doesn't just happen, which is why you have conferences like this and why you have organizations like Actsafe. There's intentionality required. There's accountability required to achieve that. Now, the reality is, in people-focused organizations that are focused on safety, we're not measured by our intent. It doesn't matter if your intention is to be safe. What matters is, are you safe? Right? The other day, I remember I was walking Ray to school, and there's an alley that we have to cross to get to his school. And before he had looked both ways, he'd put his foot down on the curb, off the curb, and I kind of scolded him. I said, hey. I said, Ray, did you look both ways? And he looked at me, and he's kind of scared because he knows he's in trouble. And he goes, I meant to. I go, son, meaning to be safe and being safe are two different things. And I know you don't mean to be hit by a car, but you could be hit by a car. That stepping down off the curb without looking both ways is going to result one day of you getting hit by a car. Okay, it's not a maybe. It's going to happen. So let's be safe, right? Let's not mean to be safe. Let's be safe. Okay. All right, next time, look both ways. And, maybe a bit too strong, but I mean, I'm just obsessed with their physical safety, right? So here we go. So just if you're needing language around this, intent, what you meant to say or do, how this was meant to land, how the joke was meant to land, how the effort to build camaraderie was meant to land for folks, impact, what you actually said or did, right? One of the amazing things that I heard production companies do over COVID to make sure that production teams had a safe environment to be able to, kind of release some steam and kind of have a bit of community. I was hearing stories of production companies like renting out an entire bar for people to be able to get together and connect with each other. And I thought, wow, then that kind of ensures that everyone on the production is in the bubble. So it's a tight, closed, sealed bubble. Okay. And the bar was a place that there was a bubble, which was a great gesture. But what if you didn't drink? I remember asking, someone who works was sharing this story. And I go, but what about for those people who don't drink or stopped drinking, or were recovering, and maybe even struggling with the sobriety? What was for there? What was available for them? And they're like, oh, we hadn't thought of that. I'm like, So intent, awesome. Impact for most people, probably awesome too. But there'll be a few people, right? And we gotta be reminded sometimes that we do have people in our society that are struggling with sobriety, that are struggling with alcohol abuse, that are maybe in solidarity with their father or their parent or their best friend who has just gotten out of rehab, and in solidarity with you, I'm gonna be sober too, and I don't know if inviting them out to the bar after work, every day after production is going to help that. And so, just some thoughtfulness around that. Now, like I said earlier, I generally believe that most of the time people show up with this positive intent. There are some forces that can result in us having an impact different than our intent. And these are those four forces. And what I'll do is after I share this, we'll take a quick 5-minute break. Okay? So these are the four things that we know actually affect people's ability to land on the impact that they're hoping to have. One, non-inclusive language and behavior, non-inclusive leadership especially. So not even knowing what inclusivity looks like and feels like. Our cognitive or unconscious biases. We all have bias. It's all in our head. It's in our brains. Our brains like patterns. The patterns in our brain often reflect patterns that we've been exposed to in society, and those patterns often give certain groups advantage and certain groups unearned disadvantage. And we're not even aware that that's playing out, and hence referred to as unconscious bias as opposed to conscious bias. Lacking intercultural skills, so lacking the ability to adapt your language and your behavior to be able to meet people where they're at, to be able to, be as effective as possible and as well be as appropriate as possible. Different situations will need different ways of communicating. Different audiences will need different ways of interacting. I can't speak to my two boys the same way that I might speak to a group of first responders, and I know we do this all the time, but sometimes we just need to be reminded that we do need to work on having intercultural skills and cross-cultural skills. And then lastly, power and structure. In fact, the power structures themselves, right? The how authority plays through, how people acquire authority, how people acquire power in our industry, in our organizations, the structures of how decisions are made, who has the decision-making power, how you get to be a decision maker, who the gatekeepers are, and the structure and the pathways of gatekeeping. All of that can influence our impact. All right. I want to take a quick pause here and allow us to have a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. I'm just going to pause my video and my mic. I know some people have been asking in the Q&A if these slides will be made available. Yeah, this is all on Prezi. We can provide folks a link to the slides. They're mostly pictures, but if that's meaningful for you as well, I do plan to share all the results from the Menti also, so that you can be reminded of what people said and what your thoughts were as you were participating. Okay, let's take a break here. I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right, we'll have get folks to come back. Hope you had a chance to stretch your legs and refresh your water. And you'll notice that I've updated the poll. And please go ahead and answer that poll. Basically, I want to share a few situations, some scenarios where impact matters more than our intent. And there's an example there. Impact matters more when I'm giving a compliment to my partner or spouse. And you can answer from strongly disagree to strongly agree, 1 to 5. And I'll let's look at that in a second. I can see there's some few responses there. While you're answering that, there was a question that was asked earlier, and it was, is it possible for people of color, for a person of color, to discriminate others based on their race? Of course it is. Discrimination is not limited. Racial discrimination is not limited to one group or another group. It is possible for, Asian people who would be considered people of color to be racially discriminatory in their comments and attitudes and behaviors towards Black Canadians, for example, and vice versa. Right? It is absolutely possible for, and as well to discriminate against people who are white looking. That is absolutely possible. Would that make it racism? No. Because what in order for something to be racism, it has to be the historic accumulation of racial oppression. And racism also implies, I hope that was kind of clear in my kind of breakdown, racism implies that there's power involved. And so in order for something to be racism, it has to come from the group that has the most power and be imposed on the group that doesn't have as much power. Hence the term oppressed, or the term marginalized, or on the receiving end of unearned disadvantage. So it's, but that said, it is possible in our day-to-day behavior. Like, for example, it is possible for a Black police officer to act in a racially discriminatory way towards a black motorist, just because, like there are times when I feel like I'm being followed in Walmart. Most times the security guards in the Walmarts that I go to aren't white looking security guards. They're other people of color, and they're particularly suspicious of me because I'm a person of color. That's not unusual, right? And so just that it's possible. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense on that question. Okay, let's look at some of your answers on the Menti of what you thought, right? So okay, there's a bit of a there's a couple of folks here whose Valentine's I feel kind of sorry for in terms of strongly disagree to strongly agree. I've learned in my own personal life that in the end, what really matters is the impact of that gift. Maybe, earlier in a relationship, it'd be easier to say, yeah, it's the intention, it's the gesture, but I don't want to just give a token gift to my partner. Like, this is one of the most important people in my life, if not the most important person in my life. I want to actually make sure that the compliment that I'm giving and the gift I might be giving really lands, right? So there's a big bulk of you that's somewhere in the middle. I find that interesting. But for those of you that landed, the 3 to 5, yeah, likely you get it. Okay, here's another one. Okay, how about if it comes to workplace safety? This is a no-brainer. This one should be a no-brainer for you. Okay, let's see how you're answering. And okay, yeah, absolutely, right? You're either safe or you're not. Even if you intend to be safe, but you don't end up being safe, like, what matters is safety, right? And basically what I'm inviting people to think about is let's expand this understanding to include psychological safety, right? And some of the things that affect our psychological safety? Sarcasm, humor. Okay, so let's go to the next question. When behavior or language is perceived as hurtful, what do you think? From strongly disagree to strongly agree. All right. Okay. Yeah. Why? Because this is tied to their psychological safety. When our language and our behavior is hurtful, and even when it's directed at people that we presume shouldn't affect them, it's still hurtful. It still affects their their mental well-being, and so this matters, right? And so what I've tried to explain to folks, like, if you told a joke, in a lot of tight-knit environments, tight-knit cultures, sarcasm is a big part of the humor. And there is a little bit of teasing. It kind of lightens the mood. We don't want to lose that. We absolutely want that. I don't know anyone who doesn't want to work in an environment that has a sense of humor. If you were to audit and survey your workforce and ask people if they prefer to work in a place that has a sense of humor, I've done this at conferences. Everyone will raise their hand. The thing though is, in using sarcasm and using humor, we do run the risk of getting it wrong every once in a while. That's part of being a diverse environment. And so when you do get it wrong, you don't have to explain your intent. Everyone knows your intention was to be funny, right? We all know. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told the joke, right? So just acknowledge the impact, apologize for the impact, and if it's something you could not do again, you might even include that. But that's basically it. I'm sorry I had that impact. I could see that it really didn't land the way I hoped it would, and sorry about that. And they may say, yeah, that joke just maybe I would have found it funny like a couple of years ago, but right now it's I don't find them funny anymore. They're really maybe the world has changed, maybe society's changed. I was just talking with this group the other day, earlier this week, about how once upon a time the jokes of Andrew Dice Clay were really funny, and now not so much. Not so much, right? And maybe the context has changed, the environment has changed, our perspective on those jokes has really changed. Okay, all right, thanks for sharing that. I want to come back to my slides here, and I want to share with you something that has been really helpful. I've really tried to find a way to talk about being an ally in as simplest of terms possible, and trying to use the language of safety to do so. And here's where I've landed. I'm doing some work right now with the City of Vancouver's engineering services, with their sanitation, which is day shift and night shift. So these are the folks that clean our streets, that collect our garbage and our compostables, and and I generally have a more complex definition of what it means to be an ally. But I thought, what if we could find a definition that really resonated with this audience? And this is what I worked with a number of them, and this is what we came up with. And they're like, we like this. Okay, so let's use this. Okay, allies are colleagues who support each other's physical and psychological safety. I go, it's that simple. All right, so when you're seeing someone do something unsafe, if it was physically unsafe, we'd let them know, right? Like, yeah, absolutely. Okay, what about psychologically unsafe? Okay, they're like, we hadn't thought of that. I go, okay, so include that now, right? And one of the things that we want to talk about is, what is psychological safety? So we're needing a bit of language around this. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I just want you to know we're one of the few G7 countries in the world that has federal standards on psychological health and safety. I'm not sure if you knew that. One of the only. We might actually be the only. I'm trying to think if that's true or not. Whenever I do work with folks in the US, we direct them to the Canadian standards because we can't find them in the United States. They might have some at the state level, but not at the federal level. So anyways, if you're not familiar with this, please do check this out. It's all there. And what I've done is I've highlighted in blue all the words or statements that overlap with an inclusive workplace. And almost every standard does. Okay? So I think this first page had, 5 standards. This next one has 4. All 4 out of 4 have some kind of overlap. Actually, these ones too. 4 out of 4 has these ones too. And the unions added this bottom one, which is any other chronic stressors that might be identified by coworkers. So I think all in all, there's 14 or something like this. Anyways, what we now understand is that there is a deep, tight connection between inclusion and psychological safety. People feel included when they feel psychologically safe, and vice versa. People feel psychologically safe when they feel included. Does that mean they're the same thing? Not exactly, but they will produce each other, and they cannot exist without each other. You cannot have an inclusive environment that doesn't also feel psychologically safe, and vice versa. So although they're not exactly the same thing, they are tightly knit. Okay, so I found this really great chart in Think Again, which is written by Adam Grant. And so it talks about when you have psychological safety and when you don't. Okay, so what I thought I would do, just, because, hey, I've got you all here on this in the poll, I want to ask you in Menti whether you feel you have these traits. So I'm going to go through this first, and you can follow along on the Menti as well. So when you have it, you see mistakes as an opportunity to learn, versus when you don't have it, you see mistakes as a threat to your career. When you have safety, you're willing to take risks and fail, versus unwilling to rock the boat, right? You don't want to challenge the status quo. When you feel safe, you're able to speak your mind in meetings versus keeping your ideas to yourself. So it is possible to be present and be the only woman or the only person of color, the only black person, the only indigenous person on a committee, and still never feel safe enough to actually share your ideas. Likelihood is you don't feel included either. Okay, so you're there, but you're not feeling included, right? If you feel safe, you're able to openly share your struggles, right? Your strengths and your weaknesses. When you feel unsafe, generally people only talk about how strong they are, what they can do versus where they might need support. You can trust your teammates and supervisors versus you have fear of your team and your supervisors. They're out to get you. They're out to, it's Game of Thrones at work. And I've been in workplaces that feel like that. It's not a psychologically healthy environment. It's toxic, right? That's the language we use. I once had this board member of this organization ask me, what is toxic anyways? I go, what do you think it means? What do you think a toxic environment means? We don't need a technical breakdown. We use that word on purpose. It's an environment that's going to make us sick, is what we mean by that. When you feel safe, you feel you can stick your neck out versus having it chopped off. Okay, let's see how you answered in the poll. And you'll notice this in the Menti, and there's a range here. And so of the 17 of you that have responded, the bulk of you are able to see mistakes as an opportunity to learn. That's great. That's a great, we can build on that. The next highest two are I can speak my mind and I have trust in my teammates. So that's great as well. The lowest one is I can stick my neck out when needed. Okay, so there's probably some organizational courage that you can work on. So anyways, just interesting, right? It's things that we can kind of consider around psychological safety. We have so much more language around this now. You don't have to use all the standards. I thought this little exercise of a poll would be kind of a helpful place to start, but we want to be thoughtful about how that's playing out. Okay, so I want to transition now and talk a little bit about my biggest learning in the last 16 years of this work, and that is that sequence matters. When I did this work at CBC, we didn't know this yet. So what we did was 300 initiatives across the country over a period of 6 years. I'm not even joking. Okay, we did a full inventory at the end, 300 initiatives, including everything from the creation of CBC's first Indigenous news website. Back then, it was called the Aboriginal News website, and Hockey Night in Canada in Punjabi. You might remember when that was still on CBC. I remember being involved in that. And what an amazing thing to be part of and to see the response to. What we didn't realize was there's a sequence in how we get all this done. And what tends to happen is people will brainstorm, they'll come up with these long lists of things to do to create a more equitable or inclusive or diverse workplace, and they don't know where to start. And so what I want to share with you is a little bit of the tool that I've been using. It's an adaptation of a tool that's been around for a long time that helps to map out the journey. And I know people talk about being an inclusive or psychologically safe work environment or being an anti-racist workplace as a journey or as requiring culture change. So what does that actually look like? Once upon a time, I saw this presentation around what was called the diversity change curve. And I used to use that a lot, and this is an adaptation of this. I refer to this as the EDI climb, and it was Trevor Wilson, if you're wondering who's using that in the Toronto area. So I owe a lot of gratitude to Trevor Wilson for sharing that tool like over a decade ago. And since then, I've adapted that concept to what's now referred to as the EDI climb. And I took that framing of a climb from Arc'teryx. So some of you might be familiar with Arc'teryx. They build like these indestructible jackets, and they see everything through the lens of mountaineering. And one of the things I learned about mountaineering is the best way to not die is to learn about the journey in advance. Okay? If you're surprising yourself while you're climbing a rock face, the risk to your life goes way up versus learning in advance what the climb is going to look like, preparing for it, rehearsing it in your mind, and then executing the climb. And so similarly, the better we all understand the journey to culture change, or the journey towards being an inclusive, oh, this says campus culture, but workplace culture, you know, all that effort around that, the better we understand where we will need to take a break, where we will need to work harder, the more prepared we are, the more successful we're actually going to be at this. So you'll see a number of things in the along the journey, a couple stages. It goes from contact to awareness to understanding. One of the things that I'm constantly having to remind people is, just because you're aware of Black Lives Matter doesn't mean you understand the implications of being an anti-racist organization and what this will require of you. Getting to understanding, that could take some time for some. And we want to make sure that we're not satisfied with awareness. We really want them to get it. Now, oftentimes when people get it, they're not so happy. It's not that they don't want to make the change. It's just they don't feel good inside about the changes that are going to have to be made or what this means of them, right? No different than that third year feminism course that I was taking at SFU. When you come to this realization that we live and work in systems that have historically oppressed women, and that as a man, I carry certain unearned advantages because of those systems, and I've benefited from those systems. And if I don't do something about that, I'm perpetuating those systems. There was that feeling many years ago in my 20s where it really sucked. It was not a happy, oh, wow, thank you for giving me my aha moment. Half my male colleagues dropped out of that class. And I'm like, how are you going to finish your film degree having dropped out of that class? We'll figure out a way, right? I'm like, well, I thought it was a prerequisite. But they weren't happy about that as well. So this is part of that journey. We want to get people to positive perception. And often what I'm seeing is that when you can get to positive perception, you want to do it, taking action is not that far off. You just need to know what to do. And, you know, when you ever tried something for the first time, maybe first couple times, it's not so bad. But maybe the fifth or sixth time, it starts to suck. Okay, so you might see a loss of enthusiasm. That's normal, right? And hopefully they've got some people around them to help them continue, with the journey and build that action into a habit. So adoption means you've taken this thing and you've built it into a habit. Okay, now you've tried some different ways of recruitment, and you're building that into a habit in terms of how we recruit from here on in. And hopefully what's happening is, as you're approaching this habit forming, the powers that be are also doing some work behind the scenes to put in some systems to reinforce those habits. So if they actually meet each other part way, you'll continue with that habit, not even realizing that you're doing it. And so sometimes as we apply new systems, as we apply new, policy, for example, there might be a dip of enthusiasm, and, but over time, the hope is that we will embed this in our work, and that's how we actually achieve culture change. Okay. So that's the journey in theory. Most of the time what I've seen is that that's the actual journey. It's not nearly as smooth of a ride. It's actually much more jagged. And for some people, it's like really like ups and downs. And we should just, rather than seeing this as one step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or however that saying goes, not see this as that loss of enthusiasm as backsliding. That's a natural part of expending energy, right? If we're climbing, we're making an ascent, there are going to be times where you're going to be tired. It's going to wear you out. What do you do? Well, what I've been told by Indigenous elders when I've asked them, what do we do when we hit those hard spots? It's so funny. I remember this one elder, he looked at me and he goes, well, that's kind of obvious, isn't it, Alden? I go, what? He goes, you take a rest. I go, really? He goes, yeah. If we were going to make an ascent, and traditionally this would take us a week to climb, right? Because we didn't have all these tools and all this, special equipment. We would take our time, and we would take breaks every once in a while, because we know what the journey looks like. Tomorrow's going to be really hard. Take a break here. Don't push through. Likelihood is you're going to hurt yourself, and we may never make it to the top. I was like, thank you for that wisdom, because I think sometimes we want this so bad. This is so should have happened 100 years ago, that we will do whatever it takes as fast and as hard as we can. And in the process, we end up hurting ourselves, and we never actually achieve what we meant to achieve. And so we want to find that balance, right? Between really pushing hard enough so we're feeling like we're going somewhere, but also not to the point where we're hurting our bodies in the process. Okay, So I want to give you a chance to identify where you think you are on this change curve, on this EDI climb, on this ascent. So if you go with me to the Menti, you'll see that the slide has changed. And this is just for you as an individual. Okay, just to reflect on where you think you might be. And I'll give you a chance to answer that. And then we'll ask where you think others might be and where the overall community might be. Okay. Look at that range. Isn't that interesting? I know we say this all the time, meet people where they're at, right? And this really matters on this work. There are different people at different places in their journey. My appeal to those that are further along on your journey, please be patient. And for those that are earlier on your journey, please have some courage, right? And please let people know what you could use to help get to the next stage. The reality is most people really can't go from awareness to taking action. It will take time to get from awareness to understanding. Oh, sorry, I haven't shared my screen. There we go. Right, so you've got people at awareness. We want to get them to understanding. We want to get folks at understanding to positive perception, a step at a time. The chances of anyone, even from positive perception, getting to adoption quickly, that means you skipped trying it out for the first time. That maybe it happens, but generally what I've seen is if we give people this idea that I'm expecting you to get from awareness to adoption really, really quick, they're going to have an allergic reaction to that rate of change. Would we like to see it? Of course we would. Is it realistic? Probably not. So we want to be able to give people the support they need for where they're at. If I was giving you supports at adoption so we can make it systemic, but you're at awareness, that support probably is not going to be so helpful for you either. So we want to make sure that what that what we're delivering, what we're providing is appropriate for where people are at. That's absolutely key for success at this work. Okay, next question here is, where do you think your team is? The people that, most immediately work with you. Oh, wow. Quite a wide range too. So, this just is kind of really great. It's not necessarily data, but it's a little bit of kind of like data, for Actsafe, just to get a sense of, we were to provide tools, if they were to provide tools for folks out there, what's the range of tools you would need at least? What is this? 7 levels of tools of supports. Okay, so that's your team. What about this next one, which is, where do you think Actsafe as a community is at? So not the organization, but as a community. Where do you think the community is at today? Okay, that's a pretty broad range of perspective. So worth looking into more. Okay. All right. Let's see here. We have, my plan was to stop here at 15 minutes to the end and actually do some Q&A. And one of the questions that we're looking at is, let me see here. There was a question here about, so let's look at this one question here about privilege, and specifically white privilege. And what I'd like to do is actually, so here, I want to answer that question, but maybe through a way of explaining the difference between fairness versus sameness. And so I've got a little cartoon here that I try to use to try to describe the difference between fairness versus sameness. You see a group of animals here. And so my question for you, like you'll see a lineup of animals, a crow, a beaver, a moose, a seal, a salmon in a big fish tank. And let's say it's a coyote or a wolf, and there's a tree behind them and a person behind a desk, and the yellow bubble reads, "For a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please take down that tree." Okay, so my question is, from here, which animal, like I'll try to get to that poll first. Whoops, sorry, you're all wondering, what the heck is Alden talking about? There's the slide I'm talking about. So the question I want to ask you is, first of all, what do you think? Fair or unfair? Do you agree with this? Fair or unfair as a exercise, right? And most people generally will recognize this to be unfair. Some people will say, well, it kind of depends on whether the job needs the tree. And often when people see that axe, they assume that what this person is interviewing for is another lumberjane. And I'm like, are you sure? Well, we don't really know, but we're making that inference. Okay, what if it has nothing to do with it? What if that's what she knows and that's what she's used to and that's just all she's known? And so it's her natural inclination to set up a test to look for people just like her. And she's not even aware that that's playing out. That actually happens in workplaces all the time. We're looking for people unknowingly and sometimes knowingly just like us. Okay. This for me is a great example of systemic unfairness. But first of all, let's look at who you think has the disadvantage. Which animal do you presume to have an unearned disadvantage of the lineup of animals? So you can answer that in the Menti. I'm curious to know what you think. I think it's kind of obvious, right? I've kind of designed this to be obvious, right? It's the salmon, the fish. The fish has multiple layers of disadvantage. They have to be in water to breathe. They're likely the food of the seal. They have no appendages that would be strong enough or big enough to take any tree down. They're swimmers. And so basically, yeah, poor fishy. And for me, that's a great illustration of how intersectionality actually plays out. There's a fancy word, and really what it's speaking to is the multiple layers of unearned disadvantage. Okay? So which animal do you presume to have an unearned advantage? And I'll go to my Menti so you can see the answers. Which animal do you imagine have an unearned advantage? The beaver. Okay. That doesn't mean the beaver doesn't work hard. That doesn't mean the beaver isn't ambitious. The tree won't come down on its own, right? The beaver has to actually do some work. And maybe actually might, if they could get some help from the moose or the human, that would actually help. Right? So it doesn't mean it's instant. They absolutely are. And maybe they worked really hard at this. I mean, they're really ambitious at this. Doesn't mean anything at all. What we mean is the way the system's set up, it kind of aligns with what, they naturally are able to do. Whether that was intentional or not, we don't know. But in many cases it was. Historically, if we look at our workplaces, that's often been the case. All right? What I genuinely ask people to consider, and before starting to use the language of white privilege, I recommend that people really take the time to understand this concept of unearned advantage and unearned disadvantage. White privilege speaks to the unearned disadvantage in our systems, in our institutions, in our history that white people have experienced. If you don't have a grasp of that, the term privilege might seem confusing because, in fact, it does mean different things in different contexts. What we're referring to here is the systemic, historic, institutionalized forms of unearned advantaging that white people have experienced. Conversely, the unearned disadvantaging of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Okay, that's all it is. And if you're not comfortable with using the term privilege yet, that's cool. It might take some time to really understand that. The challenge is with some of this language is this language comes out of the academic space, out of academia. And that term for a lot of PhDs means you've done a lot of the same reading, and it's a lot of reading. And you have a grasp of all these big ideas. I prefer that people learn the ideas first before using what I call shortcut terms, academic shortcut terms. Learn the concept of unearned advantage, unearned disadvantage. And then when you feel ready to replace that with white privilege, please do so, because we do need that language to be able to have more sophisticated conversations about this. But in the beginning, as you're, learning this, if you're earlier on your journey, it's totally fine to use that language. Okay, I hope I was able to answer that one. Okay, sorry, for the ones that need the QR code, I just saw that there. There's the QR code again. So this question here. Your English is so good. Is that discriminating or racism? I would suggest, this is just my feeling, That for me, in many ways, is a microaggression, because the assumption is when you see someone, okay, so, and this has happened to me a lot. I'll present. I remember I had a chance to speak at the Kuching Institute of Public Affairs, their summer camp. And I remember showing up, and I was the youngest person they'd ever had speak there. I wasn't even invited. What happened was the person who was invited to speak on diversity and inclusion, on multiculturalism, he was my mentor, Milton Wong, and he asked me to help him prepare for this presentation. And then he said, you know what, I'm not going to take your ideas, I'm just going to bring you. And he forced the organization to let me show up. So I came and I spoke, and I knocked it out of the park. I was very, very happy. And then afterwards, there was a lineup of people who came up to me, and a good number of them said, wow, you speak English so well.
Questions.
And I know what they were trying to say.
I would like just to thank you. It was an amazing session.
Alden, wow, you're
thank
so
you
articulate.
All of you guys.
And I was like, what did you think I was going to sound like? Did my brown give it away? Were you like a little bit like, are you kidding me? The brown kid can speak like that? But I knew what they were getting at, right? They were trying to let me know that I'd impressed them. I had exceeded their expectations. But in the process, as a microaggression, it was a little bit of a reminder that we didn't see you at par as being able to deliver when you showed up. When we saw how young you were, when we saw what color you were, whether they were aware of it or not, whether it was intended or not, absolutely a microaggression. So whether it's a, let's see, racist. Well, if they were judging me, my ability to speak English based on my being non-white, then yeah, I guess it would be racist. But you know what? I'm not hung up on what's racist, what's not. I'm not hung up on what's sexist and what's not. I'm more hung up on, was that hurtful? Did that comment make you feel unsafe? That's what really matters for me. If it does, then I mean, we could argue academically about and I don't have time for those arguments anymore. I want to get to the work. I want to get to the work of creating safe workplaces. That's what I want to do. And I just feel like this argument over, is that racist or not? Was it racist last year or not? Let's just move past that. Was it hurtful? Yeah. Did it affect your psychological safety? Yeah. Okay. Then let's avoid it. Let's not do that. Okay. Let's make safe. Okay. Let's do that. That makes sense for me. Okay. Awesome. Let me see here. So thank you for that question, though. It was nice to talk about that. Let's see here. Here's one here. How do you provide support for a team when they are at such different places on the EDI climb? Oh, that's great. Great question. Where the first thing I would look at is, let's have a conversation about the climb, right? I think that's the very first stage. And there was a couple of things that I didn't get a chance to get into is, to get from awareness to understanding, there's two key things you'll need to understand. One is, what do we mean by diversity? And two, when do people actually feel included? I actually think if we don't get this well, if we don't do that stage well, I'm not sure we can get the rest of the team past the other stages. So there might be some effort to kind of slow things down a bit and help everyone get caught up on these things. And so the model that I'm using right now in terms of talking about diversity is what's called the three-dimensional, I lost my place there. Three-dimensional diversity. I don't have time to go through this today, but I want to just share this with you. This is what this slide looks like. It's inherent diversity, experiential diversity, and thought diversity. Everyone brings diversity. What we're looking at often is how much inherent diversity people bring. So things like race, ethnicity, and gender identity is often tied into inherent diversity, but almost all teams bring some amount of experiential diversity. And ultimately what we want for innovation is thought diversity, right? So just being able to just articulate, here's what we're talking about, here's what we mean. Are we open to each other's experiential diversity? Are we not? What I find is that in very homogeneous teams, there's actually a narrow range of experiential diversity that people feel free to be able to talk about. So I often feel like that's the first thing we need to work on is before an all-male team of first responders should even begin to recruit for women, that the first thing they need to do is explore just how much experiential diversity they actually have as a team. Then let's consider what experiential diversity that woman colleague might bring. And are we okay with that? If not, we got to work on that. Then we'll make an effort to bring in some inherent diversity, because we've got to do some work internally first. And so just having a sense of how that all plays out, and you might need to put some things into place that actually help think through thought diversity. So there's some basics. I actually think that working through and having conversations with the team around how will I get you from awareness to understanding, what's causing you confusion, let's work through on that, so on and so forth. Now this, if you're going to build a robust strategy, you're going to need supports at every level that people are at. And you might need some, like people ask, when do we bring in training? I recommend bringing in training somewhere between understanding and taking action. That's actually an ideal place. Maybe right before understanding, but certainly in that area of mind shift. If you've got folks that are still at the point of awareness, they're not quite ready for training, it is actually possible to bring in training prematurely. So you want different supports along the way, maybe not at every stage, but stuff that people can relate to and connect with, and just be thoughtful about how we get them from one stage to the next. And what I would actually recommend is if you're trying to get folks that are ready at taking action to build a habit, ask the folks that have already built the habit. What support might you do? Supports might you give folks at taking action or at understanding to help them move forward, right? And get them involved, get them engaged. Similarly, folks at positive perception, they're at a good place to help people at awareness. That wasn't so long ago for them, right? So they're not coming at the people at awareness with so much judgment, because maybe that was just them like last year. So they're trying to think it through. How can I help you get from awareness to understanding? For those at systemic change, that might seem so far long ago, like they may have lost a bit of empathy for that experience. And so we want to connect them with people who have empathy for where they're at. I don't know. Maybe that was helpful. I hope that was helpful. But you do have to look at it kind of at that big picture, at that higher elevation, to get a sense of how we'll map this out and be as thoughtful about this as possible. How can we more clearly communicate the importance of and integrate EDI to create a more collaborative and supportive safety culture in the workplace? So my answer to this one is, I would first really try to find the language that resonates with the people you're trying to have an impact on. Like when I'm thinking about the folks that I'm working with, at the city of Vancouver, it's not like they're not that's where most public sees them, and the public just assumes, they're just laborers. They're not. Like really intelligent, highly intelligent people. Do they have the time to read Anne Bishop's book on how to be an ally? Probably not. Would that conversation be engaging for them? Probably not. Could we get into a conversation about safety? Absolutely. So that's how that's where we focused our attention, and we tried to find the language that would resonate with them. When I work with city planners, it's a little bit different. I might shift my language with city planners around social sustainability, because I know that that's on the cutting edge of what they're talking about, and they're going to really appreciate that conversation. So really trying to find the language and the approach that resonates the most with the audience that you're trying to impact and communicate to. And I know that's just communication basics, right? But we often forget the language that resonates for you, that is meaningful for you as an ally for a particular group, doesn't necessarily resonate with the audience that you're trying to work with. And we want to find that. And then in that process, ensuring that they can collaborate and they can contribute to this effort. I hope that was helpful to Scott, who asked that. Okay. I'm a little bit over time. I'm 3 minutes over. I know people need to probably drop off. I'll keep going for another 10 minutes, but if you need to drop off, I want to just thank you all for spending some time with me today and taking the time to learn a little bit about this approach to diversity and inclusion and psychological safety, and some of the ideas that I've been sharing around anti-racism. You probably could tell there's a bit more that I could have shared, but I hope what I was able to share with you in that time helpful. Thank you so much, everyone. Really, really appreciate this and this opportunity to contribute. But for those of you who can stay, I'll just continue to answer a few more questions. Okay. All right. So this question here is, thanks for the heads up. We can't see the cartoon. I didn't realize that. Sorry about that. Okay. Here's one question. Can you explain gatekeeping? I keep hearing this term, but I'm not sure what the contemporary meaning is. The internet has variations of definitions. Okay. I'm going to share with you what I think is being said. I like that you brought this up because I think what needs to happen is if we're going to be successful on this journey, we need to be using common terms. Otherwise, we think we're communicating, but we're really not. For me, so here's how I imagine gatekeeping. We use pathway-dependent systems all the time. To get a project greenlit, to get a production to distribution, there's a pathway. Along this pathway, there are different, I don't want to call them filters, but there's gates that are really, actually, if you think about it, they're intentionally there to filter out the best possible project, the one that's going to be the most successful. And there are people that are given the responsibility to assess who moves to the next level A to level B to level C. And the folks that are given those responsibility to assess what projects move to the next level of development, they're often referred to as gatekeepers because they actually control what project, what thing moves forward. And if you're familiar with the unconscious bias research, what we realize now is that oftentimes we will see pitches from those that remind us of ourselves, we'll be more open to them. We are unconsciously drawn to people who are like us. We unconsciously see the ideas of people who are like us as being more favorable. And conversely, we see the effort of those who are not like us as being not often as good enough. So they're going to have to work really hard, work way harder to be seen even at par, let alone as being impressive. And so that all is at play. And depending on the gatekeepers, our relationship with the gatekeepers, our understanding of the folks that manage those different access points to the next level, oftentimes it's not as merit-based as a lot of this work is subjective. A lot of this work is what's your gut feeling about this particular production company or this particular project. And it may have nothing to do with what the potential success outcomes are. It's more about, how does this fit me? How does this fit in my understanding of what should fit? Right? So that'll play out. So I think that's I don't know, there might be different understandings of that, but for me specifically, and I'll just give you an example. In a newsroom, the gatekeeper is the editorial manager. It's the person who's greenlighting what stories are actually going to make it to the news that day. And so you can keep pitching. You could be the only Indigenous journalist in that newsroom and just keep pitching stories. And the fact that you're there is great. The fact that you're pitching stories is great. But if your managing editor, if your editorial leader doesn't get your pitches and doesn't see your pitches as newsworthy, they never get made. And so it almost doesn't matter that you have an Indigenous journalist on that team. Those Indigenous stories never get assigned, never get explored. So gatekeeper. That's my thought anyways. Okay. Do you have any tips on how people of color can safely start conversation about feeling psychologically unsafe? Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I try to do is make this conversation around psychological safety about psychological safety for everyone, right? Just try to make it as, and make sure that the people, the white people that I'm speaking to, that they're reflecting on their own psychological safety. See, the thing is, when you're on the receiving end of the benefit of a system, you can't see the system. So when you're on the receiving end of the benefit of a system that's making you feel safe, you can't see that the system is making you feel safe. You probably have never even ever reflected on your own sense of safety. So we need to make this conversation as applicable to everyone. And if they can give you an evaluation that basically says, yeah, I'm feeling really safe, awesome. How can we ensure that people who don't look and sound like you feel equally as safe? Huh, you mean they don't? That's an aha moment. I didn't even realize that. Yeah, they don't. That joke, that teasing, that bullying that you kind of see as camaraderie building actually makes them feel unsafe. Huh. Okay. And I know that wasn't your intent, but that's the impact it's having. So are you open to trying to close that gap? Now, that's the thing. That's going to be up to them, right? It's going to be up to them as to whether they're going to be open to that or not. But that's for me where I'm just trying to get, I'm trying to approach the conversation using language that they can, that they feel applies to them as well. A bit of self-reflection on what their experience has been, and then some. What's your feelings on how safe everyone else feels? That isn't like you. Oh, I'm just assuming they feel as safe as me, right? Because and I'll often hear this. I just treat everyone with respect, right? And because that's what I would need to feel safe. I'm like, okay, so that's actually how you feel. Yeah, but try to help them to understand that's not how everyone feels. So all this work is often about that. It's like I genuinely think that that's their intent, is for everyone to feel safe. They just don't realize that not everyone does, and that their language and their behavior may be resulting in people actually feeling quite unsafe, and we want to speak to that and address it. Okay. Was that helpful? I hope that was helpful. Last question, and then I should let everyone go have a Saturday evening. When working towards a more diverse and inclusive workplace, how can an organization begin to confront colonial systems and tokenizing individuals in especially rigid structures like similar, for example, city employers, union environments? Okay, so let's go back to the change curve. And I hope that this will be kind of a helpful way to approach this. The reality is the conversation around anti-colonialism, that's not necessarily a conversation that folks at Awareness and Understanding will be able to engage you in. You and I can have that conversation because we're a little further along in our journey. We've gotten to a point of understanding. Like, to be able to talk about colonialism, you got to be at least at understanding. If you are talking to an audience that's somewhere between awareness to understanding, I'm not sure we can actually confront colonialist systems yet. That happens at adoption to culture change. Maybe as we're approaching understanding, we can help them understand what colonialism is. I actually think that we actually need to even go step back and start talking about just getting them to acknowledge that we live and work in systems. One, they may not even know that. Two, these systems historically have given some groups an unearned advantage and some groups an unearned disadvantage. And then what I'll normally do is I'll carry the conversation from what are the forms of unearned advantage that you have that you're most comfortable to talk about. Most people will say they're able-bodied privilege, and we'll scaffold that to talking about the one that they're least comfortable talking about. When I do workshops with men, often they'll actually feel least comfortable talking about male privilege, even less comfortable than talking about white privilege. Some people it's the reverse. I'll let them determine that, and we'll go through that conversation. And one of the areas that they will have to, kind of approach and gain some understanding on is how these systems have historically been put into place through history as a result of colonialism. That's how we have those systems in the first place. Ta-da! So we really need to get all that figured out. Otherwise, they're just swimming in confusion. If we don't have that basic understanding, and you got to be prepared for once they get to that point of understanding, their enthusiasm about this might tank because they're going through some self-realization around how much they've benefited from these structures and these systems and this history. You might need to let them sit in that for a while, and then hopefully they'll get some support to get to positive perception. Now they're ready. Okay, so they've got some language, they've got some ideas, they've got some concepts. They're going to want to know, how do I be an ally? Now we can start talking about confronting colonial systems. The work of it would probably be a little bit later on as we approach systemic change, but the initial stuff, which is all internal, we can certainly get started on. But they might have to go through a bit of that journey around, just getting some sense of the terminology, the implications on them, what this means for them, a bit of education. Some people get through that part quite quickly. Some people, it takes a long time to work through that. So it kind of depends on the person. But in terms of city employers, Yeah, I that's a kind of a complex response to that. We're gonna have to find what the motivation will be, and then similarly, how I'm doing this work with engineering services will be different than how I would do this work with IT. And within engineering services, when I'm doing work with the managers and admin side, how we go about this work of decolonization is a little bit different than how we would do this with folks with the boots on the ground, with the crews working on the streets. It's a little bit different approach to that work. And so you're going to want to be thoughtful about that. I think there's no other way to go about this. Otherwise, we either come in either like not feeling sophisticated enough or way over people's heads. And we just want to be really, really like almost audience specific in how we engage this work. That was a really kind of like try to wrap it all up in a small little answer, but that is such a complex question. But thanks for asking it anyways. I hope that was helpful a little bit. Part of the challenge with EDI work that I'm discovering is that the potential pitfall idea that unearned disadvantage equates to BIPOC requiring assistance. Oh, that's interesting. How do we get to a place where we understand it's the system that's creating the disadvantage, not the individual who has a deficit? That's a really good thought, really good reflection. I'm hoping that the conversation around sameness versus fairness helps with that a bit, right? It's not like what I try to get people to understand. It's not the salmon's lack of ambition. It's not the salmon's work ethic or their talent that will make this hard for them. It's the fact that the system was set up in a way that gives them layers of unearned disadvantage. And similarly, we're not saying the beaver isn't hardworking or doesn't even deserve this promotion. It's just that we want to recognize that the system was historically designed in a way to give them an unearned advantage. That's the piece that we need to speak to. Now, as allies, one of the things that we need to be aware of is the system and how we've benefited from the system. And then how can we use our unearned advantage to support those who have been on the receiving end of an unearned disadvantage? Some of that will be in day-to-day behavior, and a lot of that eventually will be actually thinking about how we can change the system. Eventually, we will need to change and update the system. That's what will result in equity. That's the work. But initially, the short-term work is, like a support, like an accommodation. And yeah, it can feel like we're trying to fill a deficit, but that's not it at all. We're actually trying to make a correction. I actually just like that language of what's needed is a correction. What are we correcting? Well, some of our behavior, some of our attitudes, but ultimately we're trying to correct the systems, the pathways. That's the work that actually needs to get done. Yeah, I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but I think you're exactly right. This is our dilemma right now. This is our design challenge right now. How do we do that well? And as well ensure that in this scenario, the beavers feel like they're part of the solution, not our enemy, not my enemy. They're in the system. Can they get in the way? Absolutely. Can they make it harder? Absolutely. Can they ignore this? Sure. But I also want to make sure that they feel that they can contribute to this. They are the ones most empowered to change the system. As well, we want to make sure that the folks that are at the level to be able to determine the system are informed and are able to use their position of authority, and hopefully they also come from a place of lived experience so that they are able to bring that insight. But that's not always the case. Yeah. All right. I gone way over time. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I just want to wish you all the best, and thanks so much for spending this time with me and in community with all of you. Hope this was meaningful, and yeah, feel free to share your feedback to Actsafe, and there's still a ton more questions. They haven't stopped coming in, but thanks so much for all the great questions. Sorry, we ran out of time to be able to cover them all.
Yeah, we could have easily covered, just like the other session earlier this morning. We could have just had that one and this one all day, and that would have more than covered the time of the day. But thank you so much for that, Alden. It was a fascinating presentation. I know there's an awful lot more. You're just scratching the surface with all
I feel like I am,
so,
yes.
So, and I know we've talked before the conference about having you out at Actsafe and delivering the full meal deal to us on a more of a webinar type of a basis. So maybe we will talk further about that and reach out to the conference attendees to see if they want to come for the whole thing, maybe sometime in April, May, about that, as well as we're talking to Alden about other things. So keep in touch with Actsafe about other opportunities to hear Alden speak. You can always reach out to Alden yourself, and I think that was one of the questions. How do I get a hold of Alden so he can deliver this to myself? We have links on our website, the conference website, to Alden's website, so you can reach out that way to book Alden for your speech. So thank you very much to you, and to your team for a great presentation and putting that all together for us. And I really do hate to bring it to a close, but all good things must come to an end, right?
Go have a weekend. Go have the rest of the weekend.
Go have a weekend, yes. So this is the end of the conference, and it's a great way of finishing it off. On behalf of the Actsafe team, thank you so much for attending. Good night.